Alright, you guys, our topic for today is more solving by using square roots. This time we're going to be solving ones where it's a binomial squared. Okay, so yesterday we did problems that were kind of like x squared equals 20, and then you would square root both sides and it would be x equals plus or minus, and then you'd break down 20 into root 4, root 5, so it would be x equals plus or minus 2 root 5. Okay, this time we've got a little bit different situation. All right, instead of seeing x squared, we're going to see a set of parentheses squared, a binomial squared. The solving process is really going to be the same. We got to get that squared thing alone, and then we'll square root both sides. So here in number 1, the parentheses squared is by itself. So we can undo that square. We can cancel it out by using a square root. So I'm going to do that to both sides. And when I do that, the square root and the squared are going to cancel out. I don't need those parentheses anymore, so I get x plus 3 equals, and then I get plus or minus 7. All right, and here's where it's a little trickier, because I still don't have x alone yet. So I actually have to solve to get x alone. I have to subtract 3 from both sides. But really what's happening here is I actually have two different equations, one with a plus 7 and one with a minus. So we're going to split this up at this point into two equations. We're going to go x plus 3 equals positive 7 and x plus 3 equals negative 7. And now I can solve both of those. I get x equals 4 or x equals negative 10. By subtracting 3 from both sides, I get negative 10 there. So there are my two answers. So when we have the binomial squared, a parentheses squared, we're going to end up having to use plus or minus and then split up into two equations most of the time. So let's try another one. Number 2. For this problem here, same thing, we're going to square root both sides because the parentheses squared is all by itself. So I'm going to square root. The square root and the squared cancel out, and I'm left with x minus 2 equals plus or minus square root of 7. Now, for this, since I'm going to add 2 to both sides, and 2 is not a square root number, and 7 I can't reduce it, it's not a perfect square, I don't actually have to split this one up into two equations. Instead, what I do is I add 2 to both sides, and we just write x equals 2 plus or minus root 7. That's it. If you wanted, and we won't ever do this, but what this really means is my two answers are 2 plus root 7 and x equals 2 minus root 7. But we can kind of shorthand it by using the plus or minus symbol. So let's do a little second problem here, 2b, just to make sure we get the hang of this. X plus 3 squared equals 17. So now, if we did this, we would take the square root of both sides, and we get x plus 3 equals plus or minus root 17. And we look at it, and 17 is not a number that's a perfect square. It's not one I can break down because the only numbers that go into it are 1 and 17. So we're going to subtract 3 from both sides, and we're going to get x equals negative 3 plus or minus root 17. You'll always put you never want to put a plus or minus at the beginning. We'll always put the plus or minus in the middle. So when I subtract 3 from both sides, the negative 3 goes first, and then plus or minus root 17. So there's my answer there. Okay, moving on here. Oops. Number 3. So now the way we can make these a little more complicated is by adding some extra steps to it. So I have to, once again, my first rule is that I have to get the parentheses squared alone. Okay, so I have to use inverse operations here. I'm going to add 1 to both sides. So I get 5 parenthesis x plus 6 squared equals 125. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 5. You cannot distribute into something squared, so we just have to divide instead. We want to get the squared alone anyway. So when I divide, we get x plus 6 squared equals 125 divided by 5 should be 25. And now we're back to where we were on the first two problems. I can square root both sides. The square root and the squared cancel. And I get x plus 6 equals plus or minus 5, because the root 25 is a perfect square. And since I have a perfect square number here, these are like terms. 6 and 5 are like terms, so I need to split up into my two equations. So I'm going to get x plus 6 equals 5, and x plus 6 equals negative 5, which gives me my two answers of x equals negative 1 or x equals negative 11. There's my two answers. Continuing on. Same thing here. I have stuff to do before I can take the square root of both sides. I gotta get that parenthesis squared alone, so I'm gonna divide both sides by 2. We're undoing, when that 2's there, it's multiplication. 2 times x plus 1 squared. So I have to divide by 2 to cancel it out. So I get x plus 1 squared equals 20. And then we square root both sides. And we get x plus 1 equals plus or minus. And then if you're getting good at these, you're going to recognize, okay, 20 I've got to break down. You could do it off to the side here. We could go root 4 times 5, which is 2 root 5. So it's plus or minus 2 root 5. And then I'll subtract 1 from both sides. And I get x equals negative 1 plus or minus 2 root 5. So when you have a radical in your answer, when you have a square root in the answer, we can keep plus or minus. But like we saw in the previous problem, if you get a perfect square, so there's no longer a square root or a radical symbol in your answer, then you need to split up and actually find your two answers. Alright, so take a second here to try a couple on your own. Pause the video, try these out, and then you can play the video and check your answer. Alright, there you go. In the first problem, in number 5 here, square root both sides, you get plus or minus 10, and since that's not a square root symbol in that answer, we have to split it up into two equations because we'll be able to combine like terms. I can add 4 and get 14, I can add 4 and get negative 6. In number 6, make sure you divide it by 3 first, and then when you square root both sides, you get root 12, but that's 4 times 3, so you get plus or minus 2 root 3, and then we subtract 2 from both sides, we get negative 2 plus or minus 2 root 3. Alright, that's all for this one. Thanks for watching.